How can France help Egypt? Plenty of trade deals on offer as the Arab world's most populous nation has been rolling out the red carpet for Emmanuel Macron. The French president's three-day state visit raising eyebrows among human rights advocates who claim there are as many as 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt today, with repression far greater than before the 2011 overthrow of Hosni Mubarak. What's justified in the name of the fight against a radical insurgency that targets security forces and Egypt's Coptic Christian minority? The crackdown goes well beyond suspected Islamists. Can the French president successfully pressure his hosts on human rights while trying to seal military and commercial deals? More broadly, what do Egyptians themselves want? With talk of lifting term limits for strongman Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, can the current status quo endure indefinitely? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about dealing with Sisi. And with us, Nadim Houry of Human Rights Watch. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Emmanuel Dupuy heads the Institute for Prospective and Security Studies in Europe think tank.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
Happy to be back.
From London, Anthony Dworkin, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
And our favorite Franco-Egyptian from Washington, France 24's former Cairo correspondent, Sonia Dridi is with us. Hello, Sonia.
Hi.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Back in October 2017, shortly after his election, Emmanuel Macron handed his Egyptian counterpart during a trip to Paris a list of imprisoned activists. When Abdel Fattah al-Sisi visited, only 2 have been released, admits the French president. This time, in Cairo, he's again trying a measured approach.
Our two countries have been confronted with the scourge of Islamist terrorism, and I clearly indicated to President Sisi that for France, the security and prosperity of Egypt are of paramount importance. I also shared my conviction that the sustainable peace and stability cannot be separated from compliance with individual rights and with the rule of law.
And we heard Nadim Houry during that press conference, the Egyptian president answering kind during his speech. He said, let's talk about human rights dialogue in our two countries. Mm-hmm. And then he said that, things don't work exactly the same way they do in Egypt, in the Middle East, as they do in Europe. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I feel we're revisiting the debates about the cultural relativity of human rights from the 80s. Look, at the heart of the matter here is Sisi is fighting a dirty war in Egypt against terrorism. We can all recognize the importance for stability of Egypt. But not only has this war been incredibly abusive, enforced disappearances, executions, it's also been counterproductive. I mean, if you look at the data about the number of security incidents they've increased, if you look at who is being classified as a terrorist, it encompasses human rights groups all the way to jihadi groups. And what France has been doing is not simply sort of, going along with it. They have actually they were the main supplier of weapons to Egypt. They overtook the US between 2013 to 2017. So in a way, Macron has a responsibility here. It's not just a friend, telling a friendly state, really try to behave better. It's really a state that has been enabling bad behavior that needs to stop that bad behavior, at least stop France's contribution to this bad behavior.
But we've seen a shift in 15 months. Remember, Macron lectured journalists last time saying, I'm not here to wag the finger at foreign leaders who come to visit Paris. He's upped the tone.
Definitely, and I think this is an encouraging recognition on the rhetoric. I think it was important. I think it's maybe a recognition as well that the position of France was simply untenable anymore, denying what was going on the ground. So I think this should be encouraged and recognized. But what we're waiting for is, frankly, actions now from France, particularly when it comes to further arms sales that are, in our view, fueling and not countering the insurgency in northern Sinai.
Do you agree, Emmanuel Dupuy, that under the current circumstances, France shouldn't be selling weapons to Egypt?
Well, this time it was not about selling weapons. There's a certain number of deals that were supposed to be issued after the 3 days presence of President Macron, and this time we will not be selling weapons. That does not mean we have haven't sold weapons. That is quite true. The first buyer of our airplane, Rafale, was Egypt, followed by Qatar.
And the boss of that company is in amongst the delegation, the boss of Dassault, which makes the Rafale.
There's supposed to be a new arms deal concerning 12 new Rafales, but that's another issue. It is still under the compliance of the ITAR norm, you know, the International Traffic in Arms Regulation, which is, of course, due on the fact that amongst the Rafale, the equipment we're selling, they are American technology. But I think I can agree on the fact that President Macron is harder than he was when President Sisi came in Paris in October 2017. Precisely, he said, I'm not here to judge anyone, and I'm here to say that we need to go in convergency. Now, the issue is whether or not the responsibility of France is to say it is the only responsibility of France. France is only the sixth bilateral partner of Egypt. Belgium is before that, and of course, Great Britain and United States. But it's about geopolitics, and I think this visit is something very interesting because it happens in a very particular momentum. President Sisi, in a few days, will chair the African Union. France will chair the Security Council of the United Nations in March, and France is already presiding the G7. So therefore, it is normal that states say a certain number of issues in regards to a certain number of convergency. And I hope, and I'm quite sure, let's say I hope, that President Macron will repeat to President Sisi that when it comes to fighting against terrorism, because this is what we are asking President Sisi in Sahel, we must also have the same convergency and the same rhetoric when it comes to fighting terrorism in Libya or in Sinai, which is, of course, a reality.
Would you be in favor of stopping arms sales at this point in time?
Yes, this is what we have called for, not because we don't want Egypt to succeed in fighting the insurgency, but because what we're saying is when these transfer of weapons are being used in ways that are against human rights, but also being used in ways that we have deemed to be also counterproductive in the sense of, you know, when we interview people from northern Sinai, they say they feel they are stuck between the insurgency that is inspired by the Islamic State and they no longer trust the Egyptian army.
And Anthony Dworkin, you've heard Nadim Houry's position. You've heard Emmanuel Dupuy talk about a more pragmatic approach. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's been quite interesting to watch President Macron. You know, he seems to be trying to navigate rather delicately between the approach that he has taken up to now, which, you know, has been very much a pragmatic approach. What my colleague from ECFR, Emmanuel Macron, describes as the reassurance approach that France has a tradition of adopting with its partners in the Middle East and North Africa, but at the same time trying to nuance that a bit this time by accentuating what he sees as the human rights problems, the shortfalls of the Egyptian regime, and emphasizing very much that these are concerns for France as Egypt's partner, not simply because they're wrong, but also because, in his view, they're counterproductive, that they don't help the search for stability and security, which is something where France wants to work with Egypt to achieve that. You know, so we see, I think, an evolution of France's approach. And I think that's, that's based on a problem that's confronting, all of the European countries, I think, as they deal with Egypt. On the one hand, they tend to see Egypt as an important partner on a range of issues, security probably predominant in the French case, also migration in the case of other European countries, geopolitics and so on. And yet they do have concerns about the direction of the country, both in terms of the traditional commitment to human rights, but also because they see these things as ultimately, perhaps counterproductive. So President Macron is shifting a little bit towards a more critical tone, which I welcome, because I think one of the strongest roles and influences that France and other countries can have is precisely not to endorse President Sisi as a kind of true democrat leading a successful fight against terrorism, but to highlight some of the problems. But that said, as Nadim Houry rightly emphasizes, this is a rhetorical shift. And in the meantime, the substance of cooperation is continuing alongside that.
So it remains the same. Let me bring in.
Is enough.
Yeah, is it enough? Let me bring in Sonia Dridi. Sonia, tell us to us straight here. How much leverage does France have with Egypt's current government?
I mean, I think that it's a good step that finally President Macron was tougher on Egypt because I think a lot of observers and people were disappointed in 2017 when he didn't really address properly and very clearly the issues of human rights in Egypt, which is very, very dramatic. And the thing is that, so I left Egypt in 2015, and I think what we all noticed when Sisi took power is like not only the human rights records is worse than under Hosni Mubarak, but also I feel that under Mubarak you had a sense like they were still paying attention, the government was still paying attention at what the international community would say. And I feel that under Sisi, the government don't really care about what the international community have to say. I mean, an Italian student was murdered in 2016. So I feel I'm not very optimistic about what leverage President Macron could have in Egypt, except like your guest said, except if there is real concrete actions who are being taken, like when at some point the US withdrew the military aid to Egypt that was under Obama, and Senator McCain, for instance, was very active, to ask the Congress to not give this military aid. So there was some efforts where we were very concrete, because otherwise I don't feel the pressures, by just the words are going to work on Egypt. And I think the international community really has to do something. And of course,
and
France,
can a country like France take the lead on something like this? Like you mentioned the United States, where you are, does it have to come from Washington?
No, I think France is a close partner. It's there is a lot of business ties in Egypt. You have a lot of French entrepreneurs and businesses. So of course, I think France can take the lead too. And even though the United States have a very important leverage, especially with the military aid, I think that of course France can take the leads, because there is a lot of business, and we talk about the selling of the Rafale also, but I think there is a lot of business ties, so I think it's pretty strategic. So if France wants to do something, President Macron can and should, and I think it's really expecting now, after a few years of the human rights situation getting worse and worse. Some of your guests talked about that too, but the situation in Sinai, everyone agrees that Egypt has to do something to counter terrorism, and the situation is very bad. But I think the last time I was in Sinai was in 2012, after it was very hard to go for journalists under Sisi's government. And even at the time, the civilians were saying, that there was a lot of civilian casualties that were not talked about in the media, because a lot of journalists could not go there. The government, the Egyptian government, doesn't want journalists to see what's going on in Sinai, because I don't think the war against terrorism is very efficient too. So there is a lot of issues, and now I think it's really, really time that France does something and take concrete actions.
Emmanuel Dupuy?
Well, I do agree. You were speaking previously about the leverage, the possibility of leverage coming from America. The recent visit of the State Secretary, Mike Pompeo, did not go well. The Egyptians, and I think this is a convergence between France and Egypt, feel that they are a bit non-confident in regards to the versatility of the Trump administration when it comes to fighting against terrorism, or when it comes to addressing Libyan crisis.
Because the current Egyptian government is very close to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is close to Trump.
Yes, but Egypt, and I think this is a positive step, is having a new posture when it comes to the reconciliation process in Yemen, when happening under the auspices of the United Nations in Stockholm. Egypt is addressing in a different way the question of Syria. Everyone knows that President Sisi is pushing, and he will be pushing in March, when it comes to having the summit of the Arab League in Tunis for the return of Syria inside the organization. Not to mention that Egypt is one of the few Arab countries to have maintained an embassy in Damascus. So the question of Yemen, question of Damascus, question of Yemen, question of Syria, and of course the question of Libya is addressing the issue in another matter. America is a bit withdrawing, and Russia is coming in. Do have in mind that President Putin, when he came in Egypt, promised a 25 billion aid for the first nuclear plants installed in Egypt. So there's a sort of opportunity, and I think the momentum, again, is very important for France, as we are hosting the G7, as we will be launching the 10th anniversary of the Union for the Mediterranean, with the help of the Secretary General, Nasser Kemal, which is Egyptian. We can address a certain number of issues. But again, the president has to be more harsher, not only speaking, but acting, and maybe having a sort of momentum or sort of memorandum on the arms procedures.
Anthony Dworkin, do you agree?
Well, I have to say that in my opinion, France has perhaps some leverage in Egypt, but we have to recognize its limits. And I think that a good starting point for French policy should be the principle, do no harm. That is, through your relationship with Egypt, don't make things worse than they are already. And to my mind, that would be clearly not to sell weapons that would be used in a way that's harmful to the Egyptians' own population, not for use for internal repression. And it should be to avoid any kind of rhetorical endorsement of Sisi, as a kind of leading his country towards democracy, a champion, of the rule of law, and all of these things. I think it's natural that France should try to push a little bit further and to have some influence. And I think maybe in some individual cases it can. But I think it's a challenge, and so
it is indeed a challenge. When we come back, we're going to take a look at just how much of a challenge it is. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
When it comes to romance, the French have the reputation of being passionate, first-rate lovers.
Well, Jeannie, we have a lot going for us. French is the language of love. Paris is the city of love.
But what's it really like to go out with a French person? What about French dating rules? Or what about French attitudes to marriage, divorce, and infidelity?
Join us for the next episode of French Connections Plus, where we give you the ins and outs of the game of love à la française.
French Connection Plus, presented by Jeannie Godula and Florence Villemino.
Hi, I'm Kalki. We are at Bombay, and we are going to go and discover my career in Bollywood on France 24.
This week, Valérie Fayolle takes us to Mumbai. Our guest is a French actress based in India, the only one to make her mark on Bollywood. Kalki takes us on a stroll through the streets and museum corridors of India's biggest and wealthiest city, before embarking on a musical journey with film composer Naren Chandavarkar. Don't miss this special program on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories Laura Cellier is watching for you in the newsroom. The U.S. acting defense secretary says he's encouraged by that tentative roadmap for peace that's been unveiled after unprecedented talks between Washington and the Taliban. Afghanistan's president calls now for, quote, serious talks directly between Kabul and the insurgency. As hundreds of civilians flee the last ISIS stronghold in eastern Syria, France 24 takes you to the front line. James Andre reports on female jihadists who prefer to die rather than surrender. Slow going through thick mud for rescuers as the official death toll from that dam collapse in Brazil rises to 58, up to 300 missing. In Spain, you've got dueling taxi strikes. Cabbies in Madrid call for the same regulations that have just been imposed in Barcelona on ride-sharing services, while in the Catalan capital, those new rules are being protested by Uber and Cabify drivers. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're speaking in the middle of a three-day state visit by France's president to Egypt. We're talking about it with Nadim Houry of Human Rights Watch. Welcome back as well to Emmanuel Dupuy of the Institute for Prospective and Security Studies. From London, Anthony Dworkin of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And our former Cairo correspondent, Sonia Dridi, joins us from Washington. Yeah, French activists have criticized their own government for selling Egypt armored anti-riot vehicles that they say have been used in crackdown on peaceful citizens. Not true, says Egypt's president.
We haven't used armoured vehicles provided by France to suppress demonstrators. We've never done that. In 2011, 2012, there was a state of anarchy in Egypt, and we implemented anti-terror measures. But our police forces don't use weapons against defenceless citizens. The exception, of course, is if citizens have recourse to violence themselves.
Nadim Houry, the French president, adding that they keep tabs on those armored vehicles. 200 times they say they've been used, and only once back in 2013 were they used against peaceful protests.
Yeah, so in a way, President Macron contradicted what President Sisi was saying. And there was research last year by Amnesty International, FIDH, which actually showed how some of these armored vehicles had been deployed by police forces and the Ministry of Interior in Egypt. I should also add what France is also doing through maybe not the government, but through export permissions, is exporting surveillance technology to Egypt, which may have been used to target and go after activists. You know, I mean, President Sisi plays on words a bit, and I think we need to be very, very careful, because in Egypt, everyone is a terrorist. I mean, last year, the Ministry of Interior produced a video about the threats to Egypt, and in that video, they went from, you know, the Islamic State in Sinai all the way to human rights groups, including Human Rights Watch, the organization I work for, in one video, as we're part of a major conspiracy to undermine and, you know, as part of the terrorist plot against Egypt. So I think we need to be careful. And I think what this shows, even if it's just once, and we actually believe it's more than once, is France's system on export controls and end-use monitoring of equipment that it sends to Egypt and to other countries is very, very weak. And it's actually become clear when actually in the last few years, the US stopped exporting. The US, the longest standing ally of Egypt, at one point reduced arms exports to Egypt. What did France do? It saw a commercial opportunity and it doubled down. It actually surpassed the US in the period between 2013, 2017, the peak of the repression in that country.
All right, two charts on those arms sales. Egypt consistently in the top three arms importers over the past decades, behind Saudi Arabia, alongside India. These numbers running until 2017. And while Washington has been, as Nadim Houry scaling back, the French dominating the European market of arms sales, most notably with the sale, as Emmanuel Dupuy was mentioning, of Rafale jets, Mistral-class warships. Does business trump human rights? Do you agree with Nadim Houry? France shouldn't be selling those armored vehicles?
Well, the selling of the armed vehicles is one thing, and the selling of the other weapon is another thing. We are focusing on weapons which can be used in a dual way for anti-riot in anti-riot situation, but the major arms deal are concerning boats, airplanes, UAVs, a certain number of equipment, missiles, Rafale, etc., used for war. And this is another issue. We are very tight, and we should be harsher on the use that Egypt may take in consideration when it comes to fighting in Yemen, for example. The same thing as we are, in the same way we're putting pressure on Saudi Arabia and on the other countries participating in the coalition in Yemen. Now, the issue is true, but there is a new dimension there. The European Parliament, the European Commission is being more and more relevant in looking at who is selling weapons to whom.
Are Germany and Canada, for instance, showing the way when they've scaled back their arms sales to
Absolutely.
Saudi Arabia?
Not only Saudi Arabia, but all of the countries who may use these weapons in third opportunity. Yemen is one thing, Syria maybe another, etc. As I think this is an issue, and it is an issue where our colleagues have to do the work to see and to monitor how these weapons are used. Again, this time, the president has said we were not speaking about arms deal with one. We are only speaking about a more softened, a more concrete, a more, let's say, long-lasting.
He said there wouldn't be a big signing this time or a big memorandum of understanding. He didn't say they wouldn't discuss new arms deals.
He said it would be delayed.
Right.
Optics.
Human rights groups deplore a crackdown, as Nadim Houry was saying, that goes well beyond political dissent. Let's take you to one of the lone remaining independent media in Cairo. It's a France 24 report read by Ruth Michelson.
An editorial meeting in the offices of Madamas, the last independent outlet in Egypt. Reporters Without Borders has rated it among the 20 most dangerous countries in the world for journalists.
Our website was blocked a year ago, in 2017. This is a very difficult time. It's even worse than the period before the revolution, when there were already many limitations for journalists.
500 websites are blocked in Egypt, and at least 38 journalists are currently imprisoned due to their work. As a result of this repression, few Egyptians dare to risk showing their faces on camera. Very rarely, some refuse to give in to this fear. Such is the case with independent publisher Mohammed Hesham.
There are many different types of censorship, especially a kind of social censorship, where lawyers do nothing else but hunt down authors or encourage their surveillance.
Because of this clip, the belly dancer shown here was given 6 months in prison for inciting debauchery. As for this puppet from a television show, she provoked the anger of a lawyer who judged her language to be incompatible with Egyptian values and took the case to court. We met with the lawyer. Samir Sabri has already tried 2,710 cases for immorality. For him, informing on others is his duty as a citizen, encouraged by the government.
Right now, the authorities' policy is geared towards purifying society of all immoral acts, violations, corruption, all these kinds of things.
Sabri was the lawyer who convicted this man for blasphemy. Before selling fish, Mohammed Abdullah Nasser was a regular figure on television, but his criticism of religion swiftly brought him a stay in prison, where he spent just under a year. Now free, his perspective is an unusual one.
The only moment where I could truly speak freely and say all that I wanted was when I was in prison. I could have gone mad, but I chose to accept the verdict. And prison became a space of freedom for me.
It's unclear if the 60,000 political prisoners or prisoners of conscience arrested under the regime of President Sisi also see Egyptian jails as places of freedom.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate. This one, I want to see Macron really help bring some relief to Egyptian political prisoners and give them some freedom of speech. Let's hope he forces Sisi to release political prisoners. Sonia, Dridi, after watching that report, 2 questions. First of all, how do Egyptians get their news these days? And secondly, all these convictions for immorality. After all, the military, when it took back the reins, it crushed the Muslim Brotherhood. Why are they cracking down so much in that direction?
Yeah, so, I mean, first, happy to see that Madamas is still standing because they're doing an exceptional job and they've been under like a lot of pressure. And so, I think for the Egyptians, we want to seek the truth because there is so many propaganda in the state media. I mean, it's great that there is Twitter and, that they also look at the reports from, for instance, from the foreign correspondents in Egypt, so from the BBC or any other media. But you only have a few handful of media today in Egypt that are totally independent, like Madamas. So it's true, it's a challenge. And concerning the cracking down of the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, the crackdown since 2013 has been way wider, because we know a lot of bloggers or activists from the revolution of 2011 who are still in jail. When I think, for instance, about Alaa Abdel Fattah, who was a very, very famous blogger in Egypt, a secular activist, were very, very involved in the revolution, and who is still in jail since 2014 just because he protested. I mean, that's pretty incredible, and there is a lot of cases like that. So
why bring charges against somebody for showing a belly dancer on TV?
I mean, when I was in Egypt, like from 2011 to 2015, I think what I felt in most of the situation was that it was totally absurd. I mean, in Egypt, you have so many absurd situations, and especially since, first the Brotherhood took power and then the army. I mean, it doesn't make sense. A few weeks ago, or not even, a presenter, famous anchorman on TV, was sentenced to jail because he interviewed a gay Egyptian. I mean, the journalist who interviewed a gay Egyptian, who apparently even the journalist was well known to have positions against homosexuals in Egypt, is still sent to jail because he just interviewed an homosexual on TV. I mean, it's crazy. And when I was there interview also, I work on the issue that we're facing the LGBT community, and it's incredibly hard for them. And I mean, the repression is huge. So I think, the government, the Egyptian government, is just afraid of any discordant voice. So it's not only on the Islamists. The crackdown is incredibly wider. There is also a lot of repression against atheists. That was a big issue in 2014, 2015, and it's still the case. So the army in power is just afraid of any voice that doesn't go its way. And I think the crackdown today is incredibly large and of course worrisome, and it's pretty incredible that it's worse than under Mubarak.
That TV anchor you mentioned, Mohammed Al-Ghaiti, a host on the satellite channel LTV, again, it's because he interviewed someone who's a homosexual. Nadim Houry, that's not a threat to the Sisi government. So why this need to?
I think if you look at the history of autocracies, they never just go against one enemy. They don't tolerate dissent, period. And anyone who doesn't conform to what their perception is, what the nation is supposed to be represented, will be seen as a threat. I mean, what we didn't talk about, for instance, is it's not just liberals and bloggers. It's also labor union activists who are in jail. It's also, traditional leftists. It's also people who protested the fact that Egypt ceded 2 islands to Saudi Arabia. It's also a Lebanese tourist who criticized Egypt, in a sort of pretty annoying manner on social media that was arrested. I mean, it's sort of a lack of tolerance, and it's almost like Sisi wants to run Egypt like he would run a military unit. Everyone just has to follow the rules, the norms, and not question things. Any form of, what's interesting to note isn't the actual repression against, the LGBT community, against belly dancers. It's the muted reaction from the West. I always think if it was the Muslim Brotherhood that had taken these measures against LGBT, against the belly dancer, against other singers, there would have been a huge uproar against that. But because it's a quote-unquote secular autocrat who's an ally of the West, we're not hearing a peep about it. And that is really what's troubling. Basically, Sisi is getting a free pass because he is being perceived, in our view, erroneously, as a reliable ally on counterterrorism. And actually, I would like to question this idea that somehow the human rights activists were all naive and idealist, but actually, the pragmatists are the ones who are right. Because I look at data about the number of violent incidents in Sinai every month, and what I see is an increase in that chart and not a decrease, even though it's been going on now, the fighting there, for almost 4 years.
So Anthony Dworkin, there's a zeal to crack down on dissent, but is there something about Egypt, a conservative streak that's being, I guess, highlighted right now?
Well, it's kind of hard to know how wide support for President Sisi is. because he's not allowing any kind of free and fair test of that. I think from all the evidence, there is some degree of support for him because he's delivering a measure of stability. But, I think it would be a mistake to see Egyptian society as kind of enthusiastic or broadly supportive of President Sisi's leadership. I think this is a society under great strain. It's under a lot of economic strain. People's lives are quite hard. All the divisions within Egyptian society are kind of widening. I don't think any of the sort of social, economic problems, the demands of different social groups are being solved, either by locking up members of these groups or preventing people from demonstrating. So I think, as your other guest said, the security problems are also not improving. This is a society which is not clearly kind of moving in any positive direction. I think there's a lot of alienation, there's a lot of kind of people giving up on the political process, a lot of people seeking to leave the country. But, I think that there are serious problems which this regime is going to have to deal with one way or another. It's not going to secure the kind of stability that it claims, and we should not give it credit for having a program that is doing that.
Emmanuel Dupuy, we remember, I think it was back in 2008, there were bread riots before the Arab Spring. Right now we're seeing protests in Sudan, which have been prompted by a spike in the price of bread. Price of oil is going down right now. If that price of oil shoots up, what happens to a country like Egypt?
Well, a country like Egypt is very dependent from the international community. And I think we must stress on that. For a long time, Egypt has said to IMF, we don't need to borrow money because Saudi Arabia is providing a certain number of loans, 12 billion. Now things are changing. IMF has said it will provide a loan of 60 billion. But it has put in measures and maybe more pressure on human rights activity, or maybe if a country is more reactive than another. We do have in mind that Italy was very harsh at the time when Matteo Renzi was prime minister to solve and to find what happened to the student who was murdered 3 years ago. We do have in mind that a certain number of key cases, Hamal Fati case, who was arrested because she questioned sexual harassment, to continue on the different issues which can bring you to jail. So I think the international community has a huge role, not only France, but again,
but my question is, how precarious right now is the situation of Egypt under Abdel Fattah? Can he keep a lid on it, basically, is the question.
Well, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is one thing, and the army sustaining him is another thing. And it is important as we are heading to the elections. And Abdel Fattah al-Sisi will be questioned on its capability of assuming the security along the 1,000-kilometer border with Libya. It will be interrogated by the military on whether or not Egypt is regaining its legitimacy inside the Arab world. And the fear of Egypt is to be bypassed by other nations, by Turkey and by Saudi Arabia. This is why we are looking at a more, they say, more subtle linkage between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, as and the contrary of what we have experienced in regards to the Qatar crisis, etc., etc. So the issue is whether or not al-Sisi will have the legitimacy to run again for the presidency, if another military can hoop in on that, and whether or not the international community will give him credit for the stability of course, what is burdening, in particular, the situation in Sinai. Adding one thing, the link, the recent proximity between Egypt and Israel is interrogating a lot of the Egyptians, because this is a milestone of what was the policy of Egypt, sustaining Palestinians. And we are experiencing something which is
a wavering,
changing, a game changer, I suspect.
Sonia, Dridi, you agree?
Well, yeah, I think that I was talking actually about the subject a few days ago with some Egyptians here in Egypt. Some of them are in exile actually, and a lot of them were saying that they don't think the situation is going to change in the next few years, that the people are going to rebel again because everyone is so scared, you know, like the situation, you can't even protest anymore. When I was visiting Egypt last summer, I was thinking that because the inflation was so important, and I mean, a lot of people were like, I felt the disillusions because when I left in 2015, I could see a lot of people were still supporting Sisi. I felt some disillusion last summer, but so I was thinking maybe the hunger strike will be the thing that will spark new protests. But I do think that people are still very scared, that the Egyptians also are used to be governed by the army. Some of them just think it's, you know, the only way, because also when they see a lot of Egyptians always say when we see what's going on in Syria or some other countries, you know, even though it's not ideal, you know, the army is not that bad. I mean, some people still, you know, think that because it's been in the history that Egyptians have been governed by the army by so many years. So I'm not very optimistic for the next few years. But the thing is, it will depend, of course, of what the international community can do, which kind of pressure, and if this will trigger some changes.
Sonia, Dridi, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Anthony Dworkin in London, Nadim, Houry, Emmanuel Dupuy. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Simon Harding.
Good evening, Francois. Hello, everybody. Obviously, the internet reacting en masse to what's going on in Egypt, to Macron's visit with al-Sisi. And it can really be summarized into two sections, Francois. And that can be seen in a cartoon which was drawn by our colleagues at Le Monde Plantu. Macron en Egypte, and you can see here Emmanuel Macron. He's looking at the pyramids. He's got al-Sisi next to him, and of course there, right next to it, is the droit de l'homme, the human rights, right there, and saying, well, what does that mean? That shouldn't have been there. And an Egyptian...
Hard to decipher.
Exactly, absolutely. And I think that really encapsulates the confusion that the public has seen as the French president visits Egypt. The Libération, French newspaper, with a very punchy headline, Repression en Egypte, repression in Egypt, how al-Sisi is buying French silence. And of course, that alludes to this new deal that Macron's made with €1 billion worth of deal. And it's certainly not left people, you know, numb to what's going on. Here we have EHA News, which I must say is quite a shady news agency to be taken really with the fingertips, but it does say and encapsulate what's going on. €1 billion in development aid just a few days after demanding fresh elections with Venezuela. France agrees to help Sisi, who of course took power in a coup d'etat back in 2013, so perhaps hinting to certain hypocrisies in French foreign policy. And that's really one of the topics that keeps reoccurring, is that French foreign policy. Here, a tweet by a gentleman who says Emmanuel Macron announced that he's prepared to give Egypt millions of euros, yet the only investment it makes back home is in tear gas, obviously alleging...
That's not true, though.
Well, it's very harsh.
No, there's been deals signed on agro-business, there's been deals signed in energies, there's been deals signed in culture as well. It's not just tear gas.
But the Yellow Vest movement, the real hardcore supporters, will say that not enough is being done. And of course, that is the point that this... gentleman is saying. Other people, of course, alleging to that. Here is a president who decided to ignore weeks of Yellow Vest protests and go sightseeing in Egypt. So once again, very critical of what Macron is doing. And here's one more. Give that money back to his own citizens rather than supporting corrupt Sisi. There is a lot of negative attention going on Macron. Of course, some positive tweets saying that the president's very welcome in Egypt, that they're very happy to see him. I believe you were talking about the Italian student Giulio Regeni before, and that, of course, moves us on to the second big topic, which is the whole human rights aspect of what is going on. It's the 3-year anniversary was on January 25th. Of course, Scholars at Risk here posting about an article in The Guardian who says that the Egyptian authorities were very unhelpful with with the investigation, which was led by the
officially
Italian
still
authorities.
missing, right?
Still missing, absolutely. And here, for example, just very quickly from that article, you know, the family asking Luigi Di Maio, the Italian Deputy Prime Minister, if they didn't get answers by December 2018, that there would be consequences, and they now do want those consequences. So again, it's a story that hasn't been forgotten. Emmanuel Macron, of course, his tweet, Egypt, France, faced with terrorism, the commitment, but it's a statement that's really been met quite with, you know, a lot of resistance by people reading it. Thank you to everyone who has pressured Emmanuel Macron to say this. He probably hates saying it because he wants to profit off these human rights abuses, and he felt compelled to say it because of that pressure. So again, very hostile atmosphere towards the president who's gone to this visit in Egypt.
All right, many thanks for that, Simon Harding. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.